Hello, welcome to this webinar on do-it-yourself biodiesel, keeping it safe, keeping it legal. This hour-long webinar is presented by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, or NCAT, a nonprofit organization with offices across the United States. My name is Jeff Berkby. I'm Outreach Director for one of NCAT's major programs, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, also called ATRA. ATRA provides extensive information on how to farm more sustainably, including information on crops, livestock, organic certification, farm energy, and many other topics. You can visit our ATRA website at atra.ncat.org. We are grateful to the USDA's Rural Business Cooperative Service for financial support for these webinars. Today's webinar is the second in a three-part series of biodiesel webinars to be presented by NCAT. Our first webinar focused on biodiesel production and what precautions you need to take to avoid potential problems associated with poor quality fuel. Today's webinar focuses on the safety and legal aspects of producing your own biodiesel fuel. The final webinar in this biodiesel series will be held in April, which will focus on biodiesel taxation and production incentive issues. All three webinars will be archived on the ATRA website. During today's hour-long webinar, you'll be able to type in questions in the box on the side of your computer screen. We'll review these questions as you type them in and then try to get through as many as possible during the Q&A session with our two presenters at the end of the webinar. Keep in mind, if you miss anything during this webinar, the entire presentation will be archived on our ATRA website, so you'll be able to listen and watch it in future dates. Now on to our webinar on do-it-yourself biodiesel, keeping it safe, keeping it legal. The presenters for this webinar today are Rich Dana, a biodiesel specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and Steve Fugate, a biofuels consultant with the Yoder Fuel Biodiesel Collective near Iowa City, Iowa. Rich Dana is an energy specialist at NCAT's Midwest office. He's an avid biodiesel home brewer, producing more than 400 gallons a year for use as a farm and heating fuel. In the past, Rich has operated a community biodiesel pilot project in Grinnell, Iowa, and served as president of the Iowa Renewable Energy Association and legislative liaison for the Iowa Farmers Union. Rich, I'll turn it over to you to kick off the webinar.
Thanks, Jeff. We are going to cover a lot of ground here today. We're going to talk about safety and permitting. There are a lot of issues to deal with, and we're going to try and give you as much information as possible. I do want to stress, however, that this is just a starting point for you to learn about the safety and permitting issues. We're going to give an overview, but if you decide to go ahead and make biodiesel on your farm, it's really up to you to do the best you can to comply with all the safety regulations and all of the local permitting issues. There may be a lot of things that pertain to you locally or on a state basis that may not pertain to us here in Iowa or folks in other states. So it's best that you take the information you get here this morning and just use that as a jumping off place for doing your own research. I'm going to kick off the presentation by talking about safety. I'm going to talk about personal safety, workspace safety, materials handling, waste stream handling, methanol handling, compatibility with equipment. I'll touch on that just a little bit, and a little bit about environmental safety before I turn it over to my co-presenter, Steve Fugate. Steve, do you want to give a little overview of what you're going to talk about?
Certainly, Rich. We will be talking about some of the biodiesel production permitting considerations that you should be aware of, zoning issues that may come up, also air quality and construction permits that may be required for your operation, if you may need an operating permit, and also some dispensing issues that may crop up. So we will be covering a pretty wide swath of the industry here. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, we're going to kick off with a little bit of a review. As Jeff pointed out, our first webinar back in November covered DIY production basics. And if you haven't taken a look at that webinar and you are a newbie to farm scale biodiesel production, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at that webinar. It's on our website at the address you see here. But we are going to talk just a little bit at the beginning here about some of the basic terms we'll be using. Um, what is biodiesel? When we're talking about biodiesel, we're talking about a permanently thinned vegetable oil. As some of you may know, Rudolf Diesel, the inventor of the diesel engine, ran his first engines on peanut oil, even a modern diesel engine can run on virgin vegetable oil with a little bit of modification. But biodiesel is thinned vegetable oil. It can be used as an additive for diesel fuel, or it can replace diesel fuel in percentages up to 100%, really with very little modification or no modification to an engine. Some things that biodiesel is not it's not ethanol, it's not straight vegetable oil, as I just referred to. It's not any mixture of straight vegetable oil. It's not gasoline or alcohol. It is a permanently thinned version of vegetable oil. Some of the advantages of biodiesel are that it can be used, as I said, with few or no engine modifications. Has a high cetane number and excellent lubricity. It's a very good quality fuel, and it's really good for your engine. It has a high flash point, over 300 degrees, which makes it safe to handle and store. And it's relatively low cost, and it doesn't take a lot of high technology equipment to produce biodiesel. And we're going to talk about a lot of pretty serious topics today. Safety and permitting can be pretty discouraging. So before we get started, I really want to stress that biodiesel is a great thing. Both Steve and I are avid makers of biodiesel. And if you do it properly, it can be safe and simple. It can be relatively inexpensive. It's definitely environmentally friendly. It's a great way to diversify your farm. It can bring down your energy costs substantially if you do it right, and it can, even add another potential income stream if you scale up to that level. It builds community. If you and your neighbors get together and start a biodiesel project, it's something that's going to be good for everyone's pocketbook. It is a good way to build a sense of community and for everyone to feel that they're doing something that's really good for the community and for the environment. And really important, it reduces our dependence on foreign oil. And regardless of your political persuasions, I think we can all agree that the less we have to rely on oil supplies from unstable regions of the planet, the better off we're all going to be. Some of the disadvantages of biodiesel are that it has a lower BTU content per gallon than conventional diesel. It has some cold weather performance issues. It gels at a higher temperature than conventional diesel, and there's some stability concerns having to do with long-term storage. If you store biodiesel for a long period of time, it can start to break down because it is a biologically it's a type of food product, so it can spoil just like anything else. Just quickly, the chemistry of biodiesel. Any oil is made up of triglycerides and free fatty acids. The glycerin in conventional vegetable oil is thicker alcohol, and we want to knock that off, and we use a catalyst, a combination of a catalyst and a thinner alcohol, either ethanol or methanol, and we knock that glycerin off and recombine those triglycerides with a new thinner alcohol. And this process is called transesterification, and you can read a lot about transesterification online, or as I said, review the information in our first webinar for a more in-depth discussion of that. As I said, almost any vegetable oil or animal fat combined with methanol and a catalyst can be made into biodiesel. And one thing you need to remember is that when we knock that glycerin off, you've got about 1 pound of glycerin to deal with for every 10 pounds of biodiesel that you make. So that's a waste stream or a byproduct or co-product that you're going to need to deal with, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later in the presentation. It's really important to have a whole systems approach to safety. When you decide to start making biodiesel on the farm, safety needs to be one of your first concerns. You need to plan and build your system for safety. You need to have an emergency preparedness plan. You need to familiarize yourself with local restrictions, and you need to maintain your equipment. You can build a beautiful biodiesel processor, but if you don't maintain your equipment, it can create problems and become dangerous in a big hurry. So take a look at these issues and make sure that you can comply with these before you get started. If you can't do these things, then maybe farm scale biodiesel isn't for you. But the first thing you need to think about is personal safety. You need to protect yourself, keep yourself safe when you're making biodiesel. You should use all the conventional safety gear that you would with any other industrial process. You're going to need chemical-proof gloves. Butyl or nitrile gloves are preferred. Goggles with indirect venting. You don't want to use safety glasses because you don't want to run the risk of anything splashing up behind the glasses. So you want indirect vented goggles. You want to wear work boots, long sleeves, preferably an apron. Respirators and particle masks are necessary for when you're handling catalyst, but it's important to remember that they won't protect you from methanol vapors. The only thing that's going to protect you from the methanol vapors is proper ventilation or a fresh air breathing system. So external air is critical when you're handling methanol. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. Safety gear continued. An emergency safety kit should include an eye wash station or an eye wash kit, first aid kit. Access to running water is critical. If you get catalyst or methanol on your skin, you're going to want to be able to flush that with water immediately. And keep a telephone nearby. Most everybody has a cell phone at this point, and you should have your first responders on your speed dial in case of an emergency. In terms of workplace safety, we like to see a nice clean shop. It's got to have proper ventilation. Wiring is critical. We'll talk about the problems with bad wiring here in a minute. Fire suppression and spill containment are all necessary. And you see a picture of a pretty nice little shop here on the right-hand side. It's so clean I would hazard a guess that it probably has not been used yet, but you can see that all the wiring is in all the connectors are switched in boxes that are permanently mounted on the rack. All the plumbing is in hard pipe. You don't see a whole bunch of extension cords and rubber hoses running everywhere, and that's kind of what we like to see in a nice, clean, safe workplace. On the other hand, what you see here on the right-hand side is what we don't like to see. We don't like to see a biodiesel processor stuck in the corner in a garage with a bunch of kids' toys piled up against it. Biodiesel is an industrial process, and it's simply too dangerous to do in a space that's shared with other activities, especially if there are kids or pets nearby. Terrible things can happen, and you're dealing with caustic chemicals and dangerous methanol, and it's just not something you want to do. Ventilation is key to a safe workplace. Your shop has to be well ventilated. The OSHA permissible exposure limit for methanol is only 200 parts per million, and if you get on some of these biodiesel forums on the web, you'll hear horror stories about people getting test equipment and finding that their parts per million in their shop are up above 10, 20, 30,000 parts per million. So it's super critical that you have good ventilation. Ventilation fans should have sealed motors. You don't want to use a cheap box fan or something with an open wound motor that may cause sparking because sparks and methanol vapors are not a good combination. And methanol recovery can reduce risks. We talked a little bit about methanol recovery in the first webinar. And moving on to wiring, bad wiring can be your biggest danger. Sparks and methanol is going to cause a problem in a big hurry, and that can be caused by electrical wiring. It can also be caused by static. You want to make sure all your equipment is properly breakered, bonded and grounded, and that you hardwire your equipment and use switches and not plugs, as I said before. You don't want to be pulling extension cord plugs apart. For one thing, just having them on the floor is a trip factor, but every time you pull a motor plug out of an extension cord, you're going to cause a spark. Biodiesel itself is not really considered a fire hazard because of that high flash point that I talked about. Gasoline, just by comparison, you can see is a minus 40 degree Fahrenheit flash point. Methanol is about 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Conventional diesel is about 143 degrees, and biodiesel is 300 degrees. So the methanol is the dangerous fire factor in this process. The finished fuel really is not a big problem when it comes to fire hazard. But fires do happen. As you see here, a photo from the Canby, Oregon Fire Department. This was a big biodiesel shop fire that they had to take care of. And you know, you can't expect your first responders to go into a situation like that. Steve's going to talk a bit about insurance issues later, but for the most part, the best thing you can do is make sure that your first responders know what you're doing, know what to expect, and that if there is a fire, they're not going into a situation that could be deadly to them because they don't know what they're dealing with. You can see the heat of that fire must have been intense to melt these plastic conical bottom chemical tanks to that degree. Some pretty serious stuff. And what found out was that it wasn't anything in the biodiesel shop that actually caused it. It was actually some rodent chewed wiring in the office that set some paper on fire and created a fire that spread into the biodiesel shop. And once it was in there, there was no containing it. So another thing to think about, rodents and wiring are a big problem, and wherever you're storing vegetable oil, those little fellas will find their way in there. So make sure you have that covered. And because accidents do happen, you got to have fire suppression equipment. At the very least, fire extinguishers in all the important locations, or you can get one of these Ansel fire suppression systems, sort of like the type of thing they put in the hoods over the grills at a restaurant. They've got a sprinkler head like you'd see in a industrial building or a commercial building, but they're connected to a fire extinguisher. You want to, as I said, eliminate static and sparks. Make sure that fire suppression equipment is installed. Avoid leaving oil-soaked rags or sawdust around because it can spontaneously combust. And I'll tell you from personal experience, I used to work in a wood finishing shop when I was younger, and some guys left a pile of oil-soaked rags when they went out to lunch, and in about 45 minutes it was all it took for that pile of rags to start to smolder. So spontaneous combustion does happen, and it happens a lot. And as I said before, communicate with your first responders. Make sure you've got them on speed dial. Make sure they've been out to visit your shop and they know what's going on there. Spill containment is super important. You you don't want to run the risk of contaminating the soil of your farm, your environment. So it's recommended that you have a concrete floor with a curb that would contain any spills under your equipment and under any storage you've got. Make sure you've got degreaser and oil dry available, and check with the state to find out what the reportable amount limit is in your state. You can see here a processor that Steve built called the ester machine. It's got a built-in spill containment underneath it. It's got a commercially made spill containment tray, and that's a really good way to go if you don't have a concrete floor and you don't have a containment curb in your facility. Handling oil, some pretty common sense sort of things. Avoid using open drums when you're transporting oil. Utilize spill containment again, just like you do in your shop. Make sure your truck or tractor or lift or loader or whatever you're using to move your materials around has some sawdust or a bag of kitty litter for quick cleanups. And if you do have a spill, don't wash it down a storm drain or into the ditch. You want to contain that, you want to clean it up. You're going to have a problem, not only an environmental problem, but a legal problem on your hands if you start washing that stuff down the drain. And methanol, probably the most dangerous component that you're going to be dealing with in the process. Overexposure can cause neurological damage in a big hurry. 1,000 parts per million will cause irritation to your eyes, your mucous membranes. 5,000 parts per million will put you in a stupor, and 50,000 parts per million can be deadly. And if you ever forget to turn on your ventilation fan when you're making biodiesel, you will remember in a big hurry, because it can give you a headache in a very short time frame. As I said before, it's the biggest fire threat. Static can build up on PVC pipe or in plastic containers. I had a report from the guy at the Canby Fire Department. He said some of his firefighters actually were using a plastic pipe to mix their methoxide, and the static built up on that piece of plastic pipe and ignited. So even firefighters need to remember the rules in cases like this. And as I said before, pumps and motors need to be sealed. You don't want to have any kind of motor or anything that's causing any kind of a spark. In terms of the catalyst that you're going to be using either sodium hydroxide, which is commonly known as lye, or potassium hydroxide, which is caustic potash. In either case, they can be very corrosive and they can be fatal if ingested. So they can burn your skin, they can burn right through your clothing. So make sure you've got water around to flush any contact, and you can use a dilute vinegar solution to wash it away from skin and neutralize it as well. You want to avoid inhaling the particles. Dust mask or respirator is the best way to do that. Don't let these caustics come in contact with aluminum, because they will create explosive hydrogen gas. And like I said, make sure you're wearing proper work clothing, long sleeves, and an apron or a jumpsuit is really the best way to go about it. After you've made your biodiesel, you're going to have waste stream issues. The glycerol that I referred to before, you need to have a disposal plan for that. You don't want that piling up in buckets, barrels, or other containers around your farm. It can be burned in a waste oil burner. It can be used as fertilizer, and Steve's going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But don't dump it. That's the critical thing. Don't dump it in the ditch or haul it out to the back 40. It's going to end up in your water supply or the stream, or it's just not a good thing. You don't want to dump that stuff. The same with the wash water that you're using to finish your biodiesel. You want to keep that out of your septic system. It can be ground applied, and Steve's going to talk about the rules that regulate that. But again, just don't dump it. Same with trash and rags. Spontaneous combustion, make sure that you take those rags, put them, after you're done with it, put them in a bucket of water. That's the best way to store oily rags until you can dispose of them properly. Put a lid on them and make sure that they get disposed of properly. And when it comes to compatibility with equipment, you need to check your warranty. You want to make sure you're not violating your warranty, because if you do have engine problems, you will not have any recourse if you're using above the recommended amount of biodiesel. Fuel-related problems are real similar to conventional diesel, the biggest one being if you've got water or other impurities in your fuel. They can wreak havoc on injectors and injector pumps. So, you know, that's the biggest argument for making a high-quality fuel, but that's an issue you're going to want to be aware of. And of course, the cold weather issues that I talked about before. And as we transition into a discussion about regulations, I just want to make the point that really all safety issues are environmental issues. You know, if you're contaminating the air, the water, you are endangering yourself, your neighbors, your kids, your livestock. You really need to make biodiesel properly and safely, and if you do that, in a lot of cases, you'll be avoiding environmental and legal problems. So at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to carry on with the discussion about regulations.
Well, thank you for the great lead-in, Rich. I love your focus on safety because everyone's attention to safety can help keep you out of trouble. And that's really what we're aiming to do, is operate in a fashion that will not cause any sort of environmental or legal problems down the road. There are some things that people should be aware of, and we've made every attempt here to provide the best possible guidance associated with biodiesel production, but due to the fact that there's a very complex regulatory environment, local variances, and the fact that these things are changing quite rapidly, it is very difficult to give definitive information for every location. The permitting can vary so much so that some locations may require a full permitting process, which can easily take 6 months or more. So it's important to think ahead and get ahead of any problems that may crop up. And even if you're out in the country, you're on a farm, your facility may be exempt from permitting requirements, but it may be subject to complaint-based or discretionary enforcement. And this is why a constant eye on safety and keeping a clean and orderly shop is so important. If somebody does file a complaint and a regulator does stop out to your facility, if they see that things are in order, clean, there is no danger, they're very much more likely to give you a clean bill of health and not be issuing citations, and more than likely will be interested in what you're doing and will want to know more, and that's the idea. For the difficulty in permitting some of these facilities is the fact that this is really an outside-the-box activity. There is no rule book specifically for small-scale biodiesel. But if you were talking to your local regulators, they're going to want to know what it is you're doing. And while you can wave your arms and describe in great detail, it falls under the Standard Industrial Code 2869, which helps them to determine which rules may and may not apply to you. Some areas may still be using the older system, the NAICS, and that would be fall under section 325199. which just gives them an idea of exactly what it is you're doing. Now, to tighten our focus a little bit, we are going to be giving information very specifically on non-commercial production of under 25,000 gallons with no employees. If you're doing this on the farm and you're getting larger than this and want to sell fuel, the regulatory environment changes very quickly. So biodiesel produced for on-farm or personal usage. And where we really start this whole process is with the oil collection. We have to have oil. We may be growing oilseed crops and crushing them on the farm. If you have that opportunity, you're very lucky. New oil is easier to turn into biodiesel than used oil is. But for a lot of us, we're going to be harvesting resources that are already available in the community. Some cities do regulate those collection containers, no matter how nice the barrel is. They don't want them in alleys. But for regulatory purposes, used fryer oil is considered a solid waste, a food waste, and is treated as municipal waste for transportation purposes. Some states and localities do require chain of ownership documentation, which would mean that you would need to keep a very detailed log of how much grease you're collecting at each location and have somebody from that establishment signing off that you have collected that volume. And probably even more important is that you have proper spill protection gear on board of your collection vehicle so that if there are any spills, you're able to take care of them immediately. What we're looking for is a zero release. We don't want to be spilling any oil whatsoever anywhere because it does need to be removed and cleaned up properly. In case of a larger spill, Rich had mentioned not hauling open barrels. If you did have a barrel that tipped over, it would need to be cleaned up immediately. And for a large spill, you may want to look into professional spill remediation. There are environmental service companies that can show up properly, especially with a large spill. You would want to do that immediately. So on our collection vehicles, that is a number that's oftentimes written in permanent marker on the dashboard. So if we were to have some terrible accident, we can get it cleaned up without harming the environment at all. And insurance is an area that cover. It's very hard to get insurance for collecting oil if you're not a commercial operator. But the oil collection is probably the vast majority of the work, so it's something that you need to give a good deal of thought ahead of time to plan on the volumes that you will be. That oil is not very user-friendly at 10 below zero. Once we have that oil back to the farm, there may be zoning issues. Once again, biodiesel falls under SIC code 2869, and it is an industrial process. If you were in a municipal situation, it would need to be zoned industrial, not commercial or residential. On the farm, this is much more easy to accommodate, but I would certainly recommend consulting with your local planning and zoning department to see if they have any issues with what you're doing. We haven't had any problems, but this would generally depend on how close you are to a major population area. And in some situations, they may be willing to give you a conditional use permit in that you're not a commercial operation. Methanol is definitely the biggest issue, even on the farm. Insurance underwriters don't know what methanol is. They find it very difficult to quantify the risk. So how we view our operation, to me, producing fuel for my tractors is a normal farming activity, nothing outside of the norm. But if you were to burn your barn down, your insurance underwriter might have a different idea of what you were doing. In town, methanol will require a fireproof cabinet, and you are not under 20 gallons in any single workspace. Once again, being careful and keeping things clean and orderly. If you have several hundred barrels laying around, it very well could draw somebody's attention, and a phone call is made, and all of a sudden somebody's wondering what the heck you were doing. And next we move on to air quality and construction permits. Generally speaking, air quality permits are not required for plants emitting less than 5 tons of VOCs, which are volatile organic chemicals. If you were in a non-attainment area, there may be a different number. Generally, this would fall under the purview of your state regulatory agency. Could be the Department of Natural Resources or the Department of Environmental Quality. But it is a good idea to touch bases with them to let them know what you're doing so that they can let you know of anything that you should be aware of in your area. Small non-commercial plants are usually exempt from air quality and construction permits, especially if they are not disturbing any soil and they are not operating an internal combustion engine or boiler to power that facility, or it is not part of a larger operation. So if you were adding this to an ethanol plant, it may change things, but if you're a farmer wanting to make some fuel for your tractors, generally you are exempt from getting a construction or an air quality permit. There are a few areas, especially non-attainment areas or near big cities that have air quality problems, where they may have a different requirement. So once again, you'd want to check with your local regulatory body. And next we move on to an operating permit. Some localities, especially municipal situations, would require an operating permit. Oftentimes these are based on a construction permit, so you might think if you didn't need a construction permit that you wouldn't need an operating permit, but this is not always the case. Your county or city may have a local air quality board that you would want to consult with. Some counties have no de minimis thresholds, so any release of volatile organic chemicals would require a permit. So once again, check with your local officials to make sure that they're aware and don't have any problems with what you're doing. They are not terribly difficult to obtain, much easier with their help. So if they understand what you're doing, oftentimes they're going to realize that you are improving the air quality, help you to obtain any of these permits that you may need. As Rich mentioned, co-product management is a very important issue, and that's true regulatorily speaking also. That wash water may not be put down a drain without written permission from your wastewater treatment plant. It is illegal to put it into a septic system. We need to keep that wash water from entering any bodies of water of the state, as they like to say. Land application is an appropriate disposal method. Here in Iowa, we have a wastewater land application permit that we can get. Some states do not have this. Some states do. The best thing to do would be to take a sample of your wash water to them to let them test it. But if you're just going through the steps to determine if this is something you want to do, your wash water chemistry will be roughly around a BOD of 780 milligrams per liter, and there are some figures here on ketyl nitrogen, nitrate, and nitrite. It's not deleterious to the soil, but must be applied to the land in a manner that avoids any puddling or pooling, and once again, no runoff into any bodies of water. You are going to be generating about the volume of wash water as the fuel you're producing. So for instance, if you're going to produce 1,000 gallons of biodiesel this year, you're going to end up with around 1,000 gallons of wash water. We found in our permitting process that we could apply up to 23,000 gallons of water per acre. So when the person doing the permitting found out how much we were applying, which worked out to 20 or 30 gallons a day, they just laughed at our volumes and were more than happy to help us fill out the forms and get our proper land application permit. The other co-product that we need to be concerned about is the glycerol. We're going to be generating about 20% glycerol by volume. So once again, if we're producing 1,000 gallons, we're going to end up with around 200 gallons of glycerol. And it's very important that we find a legitimate use for those volumes before we have it piling up around the farm. If it is there in that location for more than a year, that may trigger a hazardous waste determination, which definitely changes the regulatory environment associated with its storage, transportation, or use. Our favorite use for it is to burn it in a waste oil burner. It usually will need to be diluted as it has a fairly low BTU rating of around 95,000, so it is oftentimes mixed with used motor oil. Ours on the farm is picked up by a large asphalt plant, and they burn it in their big kilns. So it has value as a boiler fuel, but it's more a matter of to who, where, and when. Technically speaking, to apply to land, that glycerol would need to have the methanol removed from it. That would also be true for using it as dust control on gravel roads, but it does have about the same feed value as corn, so it is a fairly valuable feedstock, and it is also great feedstock for a biodigester. Any of you looking at an on-farm digester for your manure, it can radically increase the methane output. We have several large operations that are interested in ours, but generally they need very large amounts, so it's important to very far ahead of time start looking for somebody locally who might be interested in that material. Storage tanks are an area where we do see a bit of regulatory oversight. Any facility that has over 1,320 gallons of combined storage, this could be 5-gallon cubies, barrels, totes, tanks, would require an SPCC plan, which is a spill containment control and countermeasure plan, which basically just states if you were to have a spill, exactly how that would be contained. Some states do require that to be signed off by a professional engineer. Some states do not. So once again, you would want to consult with your state environmental protection agency. The EPA does regulate spills to waterways of 40 gallons or more of oil or biodiesel, and that would need to be reported to the National Response Center within 24,000 gallons. And they're also interested in knowing if you were to spill more than 758 gallons of methanol. Not sure why they've picked that number, but once again, we're really looking to release none of these materials to the environment. In most localities, storage tanks over 300 gallons would require secondary containment. As a farmer, you're probably pretty aware of what your local agency may require, but this is why we tend to keep things on a reasonable scale. 3, 4, 5,000 gallon big old rusty tank of oil definitely has the potential to leak, and we want to make sure that we're not releasing any of that oil to the environment. And these regulations, so once again, I strongly encourage you to check with your state environmental agency. Next, we come to dispensing issues. Once we've made this wonderful fuel, we want to pump it properly. Generally, we recommend gasoline or diesel fuel pumping equipment. What's very important here is that we are not introducing the fuel into commerce. So we're not selling it. We're going Technically speaking, that biodiesel would need to meet all of the specifications of ASTM 6751-9, which is a body of about 15 different tests that very exactly state exactly what that material is. Lubricity, cetane rating, viscosity, flash point. Most of them are really not very important to us, but we do want to be burning the best fuel that we possibly can, so getting as close to that standard as possible is a very good idea. We would like to have our pumps UL listed, although right now underwriters laboratories are not listing any pumps for anything higher than B10, which would be 90% petroleum, 10% biodiesel. They just haven't gotten around to testing the higher biodiesel blends. We've been using these types of pumps that you see on the right for almost 5 years now without any sorts of failures. So while they're not specifically rated for it, they are fireproof and safe and have proven to have excellent longevity. There most certainly is tax liability for using biodiesel. You would pay for both federal and state road use taxes. This is most likely the first place where you would run into any sort of regulatory oversight. They may not care what you're doing on the farm, but they do care that you're paying your road use taxes. In Iowa, they're currently 22.5 cents per gallon for the state. I believe the federal is 24, and Iowa is about to raise the special fuels tax to 30 cents a gallon, making it the most highly taxed fuel available. These state road use taxes are due monthly, and it is actually fairly easy to do. It just takes a couple forms to register, but takes me less than a minute to do each month. So I very strongly encourage you to pay your road use taxes. If we were to be generating or dispensing more than 20,000 gallons per year of biodiesel, technically we need to generate RINs, Renewable Identification Number, which is fairly technical, detailed, quite the body of information that you need to memorize to do that. So we recommend staying under that threshold so that you don't run into that level of regulatory oversight. Now, there are also some great resources available in the community and on the internet to help you do this safely. Probably my favorite one is a publication put out by Penn State. It's Biodiesel Safety and Best Management Practices for Small-Scale Non-Commercial Use and Production. This is probably the most definitive guide, and as compared to the EPA production facilities manual, is much more geared towards small-scale and non-commercial use. And here are some links to some other resources that I would strongly recommend. Now, I know we've given you a lot of a lot of information that seems fairly discouraging, in that there are no definitive answers. Oftentimes people don't know which way to go, where to turn, but we think that this is very important for farmers to be able to do, because there's very little that you can do to mitigate higher fuel prices, and producing your own fuel from crops that you may be able to grow or waste resources that are available in the community give you the opportunity to reduce your dependence on foreign oil, to improve your bottom line, and to do less environmental harm in your farming operations. So while we may seem a little pessimistic here, I would like to see people do this, but to do so properly with their eyes wide open, and not get themselves into any trouble, so that it is a completely successful operation.
Thanks, Steve. I think at this point we can turn it back over to Jeff. I'm sure he's got some questions from some of the folks out there in the wide, wonderful world of the internet.
I do. Thanks, Rich and Steve, both for your presentation and the slides and the points. We've had several questions asked during the last hour from our listeners, both about safety issues and legal issues, and I'll throw those out there and let the two of you answer as you desire. One question was a spark and fire safety issue about cell phone use and shop vac use. If we have those in our processing area, what's your experience or awareness of concerns about sparks from cell phones or shop vacs in a production facility?
That's a
I can, yeah, it's a
go
very,
ahead.
very good question. I'd love to touch on it, Rich. Commercial biodiesel facilities that I've toured make you remove your cell phone. It's not a turn it off, it's a put it in the fireproof box. So cell phones would definitely be a source of ignition and should not be in the area. And shop vacs also are not approved for pumping flammable liquids. Uh, Finished biodiesel, I'll have to admit I have used a shop vac to suck up a spill, but certainly glycerol with any methanol in it would definitely be an extreme fire hazard, and you should be very careful about using a shop vac or any type of pump that is not rated to pump flammable liquids.
Yeah.
What about
Shop,
using
shop
a sock?
vacs.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention that some folks may have seen the MythBusters episode where they took on the cell phone thing, and they seem to have debunked that. Uh, it, but it's one of those better safe than sorry situations, I think.
Good. So best to be safe and just avoid talking to your family on the cell phone while you're making biodiesel.
Probably so.
Another question we had is there a specific grade of material or type of material that we should use in the ventilation systems to avoid reaction with the residual catalyst?
Steve, you want
Yeah,
address that?
sure. The caustic that we're using, we prefer potassium hydroxide to sodium hydroxide. But generally, once the methoxide is mixed and injected into the vegetable oil, it wouldn't be airborne, but it is a caustic, so it's a very strong base. Most materials are fairly compatible, although I would stay away from aluminum and copper. Also has biodiesel. Um, Polypropylene, holds up fairly well, but in terms of ventilation, if you look in an industrial catalog, they do have various chemical ratings, and you can get very expensive very quickly. I would almost say some of these things could be done on a trial basis to see how they work. Anytime we set anything new up, we watch it very carefully initially to make sure that it's not breaking down or having any issues.
Another question, we talked about wash water disposal and some land disposal issues, but a question came up about composting. And is composting ever a disposal option for mixing the vegetable oil or other waste products with sawdust or somehow else composting the materials?
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to get rid of your glycerol. There's quite a bit about it in our first webinar, so folks might want to refer back to that. Um, uh, there are a couple of issues. One being that, as Steve said, you're using potassium hydroxide. You don't want to use the sodium, the lye. That it's a salt, so you're basically salting the earth if you're using sodium hydroxide. But in the case of glycerol made with potassium hydroxide, where the methanol has been eliminated, composting has been done very successfully. Yeah.
Okay, good. Rich, we talked about in the presentation that older engines are quite good to use biodiesel directly, but newer diesel motors may void warranties and cause problems. But have you seen any solutions for this, or people that have tried to adapt newer engines to be biodiesel compatible?
Well, I think I think a lot of newer engines are biodiesel compatible. It's more an issue of exposing yourself to warranty issues. Although Steve did tell me recently that there were some reports of issues with newer Volkswagen engines that were having problems with biodiesel. Steve?
Yes, definitely. The anything '07 and newer seems to be choking on biodiesel. The biggest issue right now is that the particulate filters will become fouled. And the other really big issue is that Bosch, which makes most of the fuel injection systems for most manufacturers, does not warranty anything over B5. So both my car and truck, Volkswagen and Ford, have a B5 maximum. I've been running B100 in them for 5 years now, hundreds of thousands of miles with no issues. So it's important to keep in mind that these are warranties and not guarantees. Although on a new $50,000 pickup, I don't think you want to find out that you voided your warranty. So one of the issues with these newer engines, if there is any problem, the manufacturer would love to not cover any problems that you may be having under warranty. So you're really taking that risk on yourself. So once again, if you're making very high quality fuel, you may be able to get away with it. But the newest engines, any that are made before 010, in 010, most engines will start using urea injection, which should allow for much higher biodiesel blends without causing any of the issues that we've seen. This is a very technical issue, and we could give a whole webinar just on this. So this is a caveat emptor type situation where you would better be safe than sorry. After 04 and most certainly 07, I would be very careful about burning anything stronger than B5.
Another question about the scale, economies of scale related to safety and legality. Is there a sweet spot, have you guys seen in your experience, of do things get more dangerous at bigger scales of biodiesel production and for the backyard or do-it-yourself, or is there an area of which you're probably at the cutoff for getting too big and encountering more permits and legal issues and safety issues?
Yeah, I think Steve touched on that really well in terms of, non-commercial, no employees, in terms of gallons. What did you say, Steve?
20,000 is
20,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of the safety issues, we just discussed this a lot because when you're doing it on a smaller scale, you're flying under the radar to a certain degree. It doesn't mean that you're not in violation of the law just because you're flying under the radar. But on a smaller scale, when you're talking 20,000 or under, I think a lot of the safety concerns, especially when you don't have any employees, are a lot easier to handle. Just because it's a non-commercial plant. So yeah, I think that 20,000 or under number has got to be considered the sweet spot.
Good. We just got a couple minutes left here, guys. Maybe we can wrap it up by talking. I think we want to leave people with the idea that there are safety concerns, legal concerns, but that they don't outweigh the benefits and successes you've seen in biodiesel production. And maybe if you talk about that and leave us on a positive note about the future of the trends you're seeing in biodiesel and how these are issues, but not to be dissuaded from production if you deal with them properly.
You want to take that one first, Steve?
Sure. Yeah, as an early adopter, I've really personally run into most of these problems, and they've all been able to be solved fairly gracefully. What I've been able to do is reduce my fuel carbon footprint over 87% here on the farm, which is fairly large. As health becomes more of an issue, carbon, climate change, we really need to do our part to improve our environment, and biodiesel very easily fits into our existing infrastructure. I can use it in the equipment that I already have. I don't need to invest in a whole new system. So I would consider it to be the low-hanging fruit and at least a step towards doing things properly. So here on the farm, we produce over 10,000 gallons a year at a cost of less than $2 per gallon. So over a year ago, when fuel prices went up to $4 or $5 per gallon, you've got to harvest. You've got to harvest. You've got to buy that fuel no matter what it costs. So there's a significant opportunity here to mitigate the risk of high fuel prices. And as we look towards the future, we know that energy prices are going to increase. Has fertilizer gone up? Most certainly, and fuel will continue to do so. So developing these systems now gives you the opportunity to provide for yourself, which I think is becoming increasingly important. And in spite of all these safety suggestions, I've been trying to blow up my machine shed for 6 years now and have not managed to do so, even doing many of the things that we've told you not to do. I have paid my stupid tax, though, and I would encourage you to adopt as many of the recommendations and concerns as you can, because I would like to see this done all over, but done picture on the front page in an accident or regulatory situation. But we've been able to do this very successfully, and would be happy to help people move the direction of self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I guess I would just add quickly to that as I said early on, it's also a very good community empowerment kind of activity. If you're a farmer and you're growing sustainably, you can add to your sustainability by producing fuel. And oftentimes, if you're picking up waste grease from a restaurant and you can enter into a situation where you're selling produce to them and picking up their grease, you can really move toward making your whole community more sustainable. So they're just a world of possibilities, and with a technology that's kind of open source, we all share our successes and failures, our designs, our ideas in a lot of the online communities. It's something that regular folks can do for a very low investment and get together and really make an impact on the sustainability of their community. So.
Well, good. Well, Steve Fugate and Rich Dana, I want to thank you both for the presentation on safety and legal issues in biodiesel. And remind our audience that we'll have a third webinar on biodiesel issues related to biodiesel taxation and production incentives. That'll be happening live in April, and then it will be archived along with our other webinars on our ATTRA website at attra.ncat.org. Also, we didn't get to all the questions you may have, and if you ever have any issues related to biodiesel, feel free to contact our ATTRA technical specialists. And our website I've just mentioned, attra.ncat.org, has a email form for asking questions, or you can call our toll-free hotline, and if you're lucky, Rich Dana himself may answer your question directly. On behalf of the National Center for Appropriate Technology and ATTRA, I want to thank you for joining our webinar and urge you to tune in again in April for our third one, and thank you very much, our audience, for your time. Goodbye.